Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very pleased to share the conversation I had with Michael Muthukrishna. Michael is the Associate Professor of Economic Psychology at the London School of Economics. He's also affiliated with Developmental Economics Group at STI Curd. He's also affiliated with Data Science Institute, fellow at Charter Cities Institute, board member of One Pencil Project, technical director of the Database of Religious History, and many others. And he is mostly interested in different questions, big questions. Why are humans different to other animals? Psychological evolutionary processes for culture and social change, and how we can answer those questions in different ways, and using computational modeling, using different types of evolutionary models, and various data science methods from psychology and economics. He is the author of the latest book, Theory of Everyone, the new science of who we are, how we got here, and where we're going. That title might be a little bit different in the kind of out in the rest of the world with the U.S. editions. There's always these kind of different, slightly different titles everywhere. But the main title is A Theory of Everyone. And we talk about the book. The book is fantastic. I greatly enjoyed it. We start out by talking on why he wrote a book that's so broad sweeping. You don't call a book A Theory of Everyone, and it's not, very broad. So he talks about that. We talk about theory and theoretical frameworks and why that's necessary. We talk about energy. It's a big part, especially the first half of the book, how energy is essential in cooperation. We talk about corruption in cooperation, dark sides of cooperation, how cooperation fueled human growth and innovation. Talk about the kind of laws of life he details in the book. We talk about intelligence. We have a nice kind of exchange about intelligence. We don't see eye to eye on some of that, so that was a lot of fun. And some of the cultural factors. Talk about immigration issues, wealth inequality, meritocracy, and many other topics. Michael was such a delight. It was one of those conversations where I didn't want it to end. I wanted to keep going. Could have kept going for another 2-3 hours. We got on well together, and he's just someone that you want to bounce ideas off of and talk about things and kind of unravel things. And so he's absolutely great. I really did enjoy his book. I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope listeners will as well. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergentdialogues.substack.com. Get over there, subscribe, like, share with friends. You also can contribute as well. I'm also on YouTube and all the places where you find your podcast. So now I bring you Michael Muthukrishna. I am here with Michael Muthukrishna. Michael, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I've been really looking forward to talking with you in this conversation. So I'm very excited to have you on.
Me too. Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I love the questions that you sent me before.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, you wrote a fantastic book, which I've enjoyed reading it, and I've been hearing rumblings from other people that have been getting it. I know this is out in a few countries already, and so people have been really enjoying it. And I had a few people ask me like, "Are you going to get him on?" I was like, "Yeah. He's going to come on." So some people are very much looking forward to the conversation, as am I. So. You've written a fabulous book called A Theory of Everyone, Who We Are, How We Got Here, and Where We're Going. So before we get into all the details of the book, why don't you tell listeners who you are professionally, academically, and what you're currently up to?
Sure. So I'm a professor at the London School of Economics. My official title is economic psychologist, but I have affiliations with Sticker's Developmental Economics and with data science. Um, I guess I kind of have an unusual disciplinary background. So my undergrad was actually in engineering, and I did a dual degree with psychological and behavioral science. But I kind of took a lot of different subjects, and my goal was to kind of apply that to engineering design. And then in grad school, I worked with Joe Henrik, who many people know. Joe was cross appointed in psychology and economics, and so I kind of took courses in both of those. And then I worked with people like Michael Dobley, took courses in evolutionary biology. in data science and statistics, and then moved to Harvard's Human Evolutionary Biology department before I took on my current role. So all of that kind of is reflected in the book. I think readers will see.
I was just gonna say, so yeah, you're well primed to talk about in all of these different kind of sectors. I think you mentioned it in a few places in the book too. I guess just before we get to the specifics, why did you want to write such a very broad sweeping book and talk about all of these different things? You have stuff, evolutionary theory, you have cooperation, you have physics, you have some biology, you got everything in there. Why did you want to tackle some of the things that you tackle in such a big abstract way, but also with a lot of details in there as well? Why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is it's kind of a narrow title. Like it could have been like a theory of everything. This is just everyone. So it's a bit more
Sure.
circumscribed. No, I'm kidding.
Right.
No, so I mean, one piece of advice that I got in my career is don't write a book because I don't know, you just want to write a book or it feels like that moment in your career. You should write it because it's kind of bursting out of you, right? Like it's almost like
Mm,
you can't not write the book. And
mhm,
that's really how it felt. So, I think probably for the last, I don't know, let's say 5 years, I've been wanting to write it, and I was kinda it was bursting out of me. Um, I felt like all of these discussions and debates were happening in the world around energy, around, inflation, around immigration, and I felt like, the work that I'd been doing and the reason that I kinda got into this field, moved from engineering here, we had answers to this. In fact, we had different ways of even asking the question, and so it was frustrating me, and I think it was when I got, tenure a few years back that I had the space to just sit down and get it out there. In terms of all of the disciplines that come to play there, I'm not a huge fan of terms like multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary because it seems to like put the emphasis on you have to take these things from other places. So my preferred term is like non-disciplinary or undisciplined. So
mhm,
the idea is that you've got these questions and you want to answer them in a way that is as convincing as it can be to yourself and then hopefully to other people. And it doesn't really matter where the tools you bring to bear on the question come from. Like maybe they're in economics, maybe they're in evolutionary biology, maybe they're in political science, whatever. Wherever they are, it doesn't really matter as long as they're convincing tools and they can be used sometimes in conjunction with each other. Um, what I wanted to explain to people because this was frustrating me and I could see all of these problems that had solutions, partial solutions, great solutions, solutions that ought to be discussed more and more. I wanted to kind of write a book that explained this theory of everyone, this moment that I felt we were in the human and social sciences, and then show people how it could help us tackle many of the problems that we face today. That, in my view, there's just a lot of like wiggle switch science going on. So wiggle switch science is this idea that you got a confusing world and you do these A/B tests basically on it. Like
mhm,
what if we present the information like this? What if the social network looks like this? What if, and you can't really make progress in that way. There's no way to accumulate that knowledge. I had it was actually the conclusion to my dissertation, but a paper I wrote a while ago called "A Problem in Theory"
mm,
with Joe Henrik, where I lay this out and I said, all of these concerns you have about replication and fraud or whatever, they're not just about statistical shenanigans and methodological malpractice. They are fundamentally the way that you are approaching these questions about
mm,
humans and about the social world
mhm,
is strange. No other science would see this or understand what was happening here. There was no way to accumulate this. At best, you're working on these mini theories that don't really talk to each other. And I saw
mhm,
this even, when I was really frustrated as an undergrad in psychology because I was like, this is the most interesting question that you could be trying to tackle. And yet all of these tools exist in other sciences that you're not bringing to bear, and I don't understand why.
mm,
And you're talking about things like stereotypes, and then you're talking about things like norms, and somehow these two things are not connected. Like, why is influence and persuasion two separate things? Like, this doesn't make sense to me.
mhm,
But, that's fine. It's fine that you've got a problem. It's nice to admire the problem. It's better if you have a solution. And I think that is the moment. The central claim of the book is that a science matures into a real science. It goes through puberty. It only really becomes a science when it reaches this point where it has this overarching theoretical framework that allows it to separate sense from nonsense, and it allows it to turn science into technology. It allows you to actually act in the world with some amount of confidence. So I think the oldest of the sciences, let's say physics, right? Like the world used to be chaotic and confusing, right? We used to think that Thor was banging his hammer and all of the things that happened were the result of these capricious gods. And then
Mm.
people like Newton and Einstein and Maxwell, they come along and they write down equations and they make sense. They turn that chaos and confusing world into something that is understandable. It's not always predictable. So, the weather is still difficult to predict, but at least we now know it's not Thor. We understand how it works. And it's really not about like the brilliance of the scientist. So Sir Isaac Newton himself is trying to turn lead into gold because that revolution hadn't happened in the chemical world. Like we were in a world of alchemy. Now you can make a lot of progress in with alchemy. Like we made gunpowder. We made we realized that when you mix an acid with a particular metal, you get a gas. Like we could do stuff like that, but it wasn't obvious without a periodic table and an understanding that the world was made out of atoms and elements that you can't actually turn lead into gold without a star, let's say, or a large super collider. But once you have that, then alchemy becomes chemistry. And you go, oh, these are the pieces that are actually missing. I can actually eventually get to things like protein folding. And biology was the same way, right? Like we used to think that like it was why does the peacock have this giant elaborate tail and why is the peahen a drab brown and why do some animals lay eggs and others have live births? It's chaotic. Who knows what's going on here? And then Darwin comes along, and eventually the modern synthesis with Wright and Fisher writing down the equations, working it out. And now we understand it's still difficult to predict the trajectory of a species. It's still difficult to predict an ecology. But an ecologist without the rules of evolutionary biology would be running blind. Like you can't infer those rules by measuring, the water and the foxes and the squirrels. And so you can't get it out of the system. You need that theory. Without that theory, you're stuck doing things like, okay, well, the planet was there last time, so maybe it's going to be there again. What you need is a science of orbital mechanics, right? Anyway, so that's great, and the central claim, as I said in the book, is that this has happened in the human and social sciences, and as people are exposed to it, they're excited and they can begin to use it in their own work. So you have like biologists like Kevin Leyland, you've got economists like Nathan Nunn, who are beginning to integrate this into their work, into their worldview, and it's making some interesting progress.
Mm.
So that's one part of it, just this frustration and wanting to get it out there. The second part of it was that it matters, right? Like getting these answers right, understanding the world in a way that we can act on it matters because, as I say in the book, the 21st century might be the most important century in human history. And there's a number of reasons why, but one particular reason is actually to do with our energy budgets and energy control. And some social scientists in particular said to me, and it's like that. I was not expecting that in the book. It was like, where exactly did that come from? But it makes a lot of sense in terms of you'll see when you read the book. It really makes a lot of sense in terms of what I study, which is human cooperation. So one of the puzzles that I'm interested. So I got in this field because I wanted to understand how we would tackle some of the problems around climate change, for example. Right? It seemed to me when I was finishing undergrad that everybody was so focused on mitigation, and I was like, okay, great, maybe we'll slow the economy to save the planet. But what if we don't? Do we know how to handle like a million people from Bangladesh or the South Pacific, let's say from Bangladesh flooding into India and then into Pakistan and then into the Middle East and Europe? Like, do we know how to handle that many people? How do we know how to maintain governance under those conditions? Do we know how to handle the cultural clash? Do we know how to handle infrastructure? Do we know any of this? We don't have a science. We don't have an ability to deal with that in the way that we do the physical sciences. And this was the part of this puzzle is how is it that humans cooperate in the first place? Like how is it that you and I from different places in the world, for completely different ancestries, we could have done this call in the same room, right?
Mhm.
And that is kind of weird, right? Like if we were two chimps, we'd be like two dead and maimed chimps. We'd be at each other's
Yeah.
throats if we were strangers.
Mhm.
And even 200 years ago, this would be kind of a weird thing, right? Like we would probably not trust each other because we weren't cooperating at this kind of anonymous, multi-ethnic, large, scale that we do today. And even in some places around the world, like, oh yeah, we could totally do this in the United States, but could we do it in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Like in Australia, yeah, but Afghanistan, like there are places where even today. So this puzzle is so puzzling that in 2005, Science Magazine listed how is it that cooperation evolved is one of its top 25 big questions for the coming quarter century. It's been a while. 2005 to me feels like yesterday, but my students tell me
Yeah,
that was roughly when they were born or something.
I know.
Um,
It's a
yeah, it
strange
was a long time
thing.
ago. And, we've made a lot of progress since then, and before then too, and we've begun to understand the mechanisms that allow cooperation to work, to flourish, right? Why is it that,
Mm,
people and other animals will work, and not always defect, and will work together for mutual benefit? So, some of the mechanisms that have been identified are things like, inclusive fitness and kin selection. So this we find across the animal kingdom. Um, Genes that can identify and favor copies of themselves will spread at the expense of those that don't, according to kind of Hamilton's rule, where the relatedness times benefit, as long as that's greater than the cost, then that should spread. So you might hear sometimes if love is a mystery. Like, who can explain the bonds of family? Actually, we can explain it really well. It's
mhm,
not a mystery at all. Then you can get a little further because that would limit you to cooperation with related individuals, which is what humans did. We had bands of related individuals. But we went a lot further than that. So you can go further with direct reciprocity, sometimes called reciprocal altruism. So this is the idea of you scratch my back, I scratch yours, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And this gets you to the level of people that you regularly interact with. So you might not like all your office mates, but you'll learn to like them because it's mutual benefit, right? An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You screw me over, I screw you over. As long as we're, have repeated encounters, it's fine. That's why con men can come in and then leave again because they're not part of that system. They're just acting like they are. That gets you to people you know and regularly interact with. Then you can go a little further with reputation. So I don't know who you are, you don't know who I am, but I know of you, and therefore I might be willing to work with you because I heard that Joe Henrik was on the show and he says, "Hey, he's a good guy. Like you should
mhm,
definitely work with him."
mhm.
Um,
So status and reputation are very important for trying to understand how do we cooperate with people we're less closer to for
exactly,
whatever thing.
exactly.
Mhm,
As long as you know of people, then you can, and if you trust the reputational information, you might be able to work with them.
mhm,
And actually, you can see the limits of this when we overcame it. So when you and I were kids, your parents probably told you never get in a car with a stranger,
mhm.
never go to a stranger's house, right?
Avoid the
But
white
actually, I get in
vans.
cars. Yeah, with the white vans. If someone's offering you candy, come home. I got candy at home. Um, but I actually get in. I'm not a kid anymore, but I could probably send my kid in a car with a stranger. And sometimes the whole family sleeps in someone else's house. Why? Because of companies like Uber and Airbnb.
Mhm,
And that is a reputational system, but it is a securitized reputational system
mhm,
where as long as we trust the institution, or in this case, the company, the corporation, then we can, they do the management of the reputation for us. We don't have to trust the accuracy. And if you get bad reviews and the signal just starts to deteriorate, the same dynamics apply.
mhm,
Great. Now we're up to people we know of, but even there's a limit.
mhm,
If you ask economists, like how do you get cooperation in the kind of scales we find today, they'll say it's institutions. And they're
mhm,
right, of course, right? Like, so if somebody steals something from me, I'm typically not like, um, what's the line? I have a certain set of skills and I'm coming to get you. Like, I'm not going after these people directly. I pay my taxes for a police force and a judiciary, and a court system and governments and so on, and they do the punishing for me. Great. Seems like we've solved it. We now have this institution. So there's a couple of puzzles there. One is, how do you get from a reputational based system to an institution system? And people have implicated things like religion as a proto institution. So the idea is that, maybe you are a hijabi woman and I'm a hijabi woman, and we know what beliefs are associated with that. And even though we don't know anything about each other, we don't even know of each other, we're slightly more likely to trust each other. And then the institution can build from there. The systems like that. That's one puzzle. But the other puzzle is, if you've ever traveled, if you've ever lived in other parts of the world, then you know that institutions don't work equally well everywhere,
mhm,
right? They are often undermined, and they're typically undermined by what we call corruption.
mhm,
And so my family's from Sri Lanka. I left when I was like 2 years old. I grew up in Botswana. I've lived in Papua New Guinea. I've lived in Australia. I've lived in Canada, the United States, and now the UK. And I can see, and I've traveled a lot. I can see that these institutions and the degree to which they survive varies considerably.
mhm.
And from a Western weird, in the Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic sense, people are like, I need to explain corruption. Like, why is it that these places are corrupt? From my perspective, corruption is super easy to explain. We don't need to explain corruption. What we need to explain is why some places are not corrupt.
Mhm.
That's what's puzzling. Because what we call corruption is actually those lower scales of cooperation undermining the higher scales. So like if a president were to give a contract to his son, we go, "Oh, that's nepotism."
Mhm.
But it's also inclusive fitness or kin selection undermining the institution.
Mhm.
If a manager would give a job to a friend or a friend of a friend, we call that cronyism.
Mhm.
But it's also direct or indirect reciprocity, just like lobbying and bribery, undermining the meritocracy.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm.
So that was one of my contributions to the literature, and then I started thinking. I was like, wait a minute, wait a minute, wait a minute. If all of these scales are always present, and the lower order scales are in fact more natural, found across the animal kingdom, and at least some of them are more stable than these higher scales, and how the hell did we get here? Like, how did we get to this world where anonymous strangers can meet one another? That needs another explanation.
Mhm.
And so I began to think about the problem. I was staring at these models. We were working through some of the math, and I was like, you know what? It needs something that allows you to transition between these scales, because quite often, what ends up happening is that countries are trapped in suboptimal equilibria, right? So, in many countries, like for example, many Latin American countries suffer from a lot of nepotism, right?
Mhm.
It's not surprising, when la familia es tutto, when like family is everything, then everyone is behaving in that way, from the local shopkeeper to the person who has to has obligations to help you find the job, the government minister who is handing out favors to friends and family.
Mm.
The problem is that the normative pillars, the cultural pillars that uphold those invisible aspects of culture that uphold our institutions aren't present, right? So that's part of it. So if you can suppress those lower order scales, then you get things that work. So I started doing some reading into the corruption literature at the same time. Joe Henrik and Jonathan Beaucamp and Jonathan Schultz and Duman Rod, um, they were working. They were working on what was going on with the Catholic Church in Europe, and the role that the Catholic Church had in. This is Joe's book. Sorry, the weirdest people in the world, and there was a science paper associated with this. When the Catholic Church bans cousin marriage and engages in a
Mhm.
bunch of practices, it
Mhm.
destroys European tribes,
There was something
because
where
in
it
many
was
places.
it was it was higher in Sicily and southern Italy, and it was lower in the northern part or something like that. There was some correlation with certain regions or something, I can't quite remember.
Exactly. So you can yeah, exactly. So what they show is that when you look at the bishoprics where these bishops were
Mhm.
at the time that they were there, the longer they experience this kind of destroying of the European tribes, the more successful their
Mhm.
democracies are today. The lower their corruption levels and so on, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So what seems to have happened is that, so in many places around the world, tribalism is a problem. Tribalism undermines states. Like when I was in Papua New Guinea, they had what they would call a one talk system. Every one talk is in pidgin, like one talk, like one language. People operated at that scale, right? And that undermined institutions. They had the same institutions that Australia had, Westminster parliamentary institutions brought from Britain, but they were very unsuccessful. Because when you're marrying your cousins, then your uncle isn't just your uncle, he's connected to you by all of these connections and obligations. And so you can scale up your cooperation via kin selection or inclusive fitness to the point where it's undermining states, right?
Mm.
So that's one part of the puzzle. You can suppress these lower order scales. But the other part is that when we write down these models, we design them as dilemmas, right?
Mhm.
Like it's only interesting if like it's better for me to work by myself than it is to cooperate. Otherwise, there's no paper to be written, right? It's like, oh, we set up the payoff so it always pays to cooperate. Cool. But it's also possible that in the real world we do exist in positive sum situations. There may be things that turn the world positive sum.
Mm.
And so when I was looking for things that might actually do this, I realized there's only really one thing that might have happened and that makes a lot of sense. And as I looked at the data and fit it against levels of cooperation, it made perfect sense. And that is energy control. And there's a
Mm.
particular metric in the energy sciences called the energy return on investment. So this is the amount of energy it takes to get some amount of energy back. You can think of it as like a metric of excess energy. And excess energy is what multiplies your efforts, right? Like Winston Churchill says, a man, who uses coal to do his work can multiply his efforts by 10 to 100 times or whatever. And, he's pointing out that nuclear can do much more than that. Because you think about anything that you do, doing your washing, traveling across the globe, even the food you eat, the amount of work that would be required to do that using human labor or animal labor with those kinds of energy return on investments it wouldn't feed the population that we have today, right? Not only is it like fossil fuel tractors, but we literally take natural gas and combine it with nitrogen in the air to create ammonia with the Haber-Bosch process. And roughly at least 4 billion people are alive today thanks to that, right? So if you look across like all of human history, there were these key um, moments that were kind of energy revolutions that truly multiplied our productivity, our population sizes, and created temporarily at least a world of abundance. So the first one for human, and incidentally, the book starts with like non-life to bacteria and
Mhm,
shows
mhm,
how these laws. So I call them laws of life.
mhm,
I'm very clear in the book. Like I call them laws of life because they apply from bacteria to businesses, from cells to societies. They are truly fundamental, but they're not like Newtonian laws. They're more like lenses with which you can view the world. They are the essential levers, the things that really matter. So they are like the law of energy, that ultimately what makes matter alive is energy, and what life is doing is competing over energy. The law of innovation, so when you can do more with less, you will do that. There's a ceiling created by the law of energy and a floor created by the law of innovations, which creates more efficiency. And within that is what I call the space of the possible. If you shoot up the ceiling because you've got high excess energy, there's larger space that encourages greater cooperation. So single cells becoming multicellular, complex multicellular, eventually animals. If you're an animal and you're spending more time hunting than you're getting back in calories, you will be outcompeted by lower scales of cooperation like bacteria and cancers, or by
mhm,
other animals who have greater energy, right?
mhm,
And that is, I'll get to this in a second, but that is the story of colonialization actually. So let's start with fire though. So fire was the first unlocking of energy. So one of the best pieces of evidence for the fact that we are a species entirely reliant on culturally transmitted information is the fact that our jaws are too weak, our guts are too short, and we have giant energy intensive brains that require cooked food. Like if you're a raw
mhm,
foodist, you're going to need a lot of supplements and more food than you can possibly produce for yourself. What cooking does is it pre-digests food and makes it more bioavailable for you, which means you need to be able to cook and you need to be able to make fire. And neither of those things, as you ask any college student, there's no genes for cooking. And there's not even genes for fire, right? You can't do that. And yet, so we need that. This is something that had to be transmitted. But once we had that, once we reliably were able to transmit fire making or even fire keeping, so sometimes you would just keep an ember alive, then we were able to cook food and we were able to support those giant brains of ours because brain tissue is 20 times as expensive as muscle tissue. And most animals invest in brawn than brain. All right, let me keep going. The second major unlocking of energy was agriculture. So
mhm,
this was again a solar technology. Rather than expending a lot of energy going out and hunting and gathering and all of that excess energy, sorry, all of that energy you spend walking around has to be paid back in the return. You plant in one place. You begin to have animals that you're growing, and they can help you do work as long as you're producing enough food to feed you and your family. And there's a large amount of excess energy to the point where our populations grew very large. We were actually unhealthier at first compared to the hunter gatherers around them, but our populations grew large enough that we began to push out hunter gatherers to the margins where they still live. So hunter gatherers tend to live these days in deserts or very thick forests because that's where agriculturalists push them to. That eventually, at first, this is a world of abundance because you've got this new technology that allows you to grow, but then eventually abundance turns to scarcity
mhm,
because agriculturalists are now fighting with other agriculturalists, incentivizing warfare and technology and so on. After agriculture, the next major unlocking of energy that really created the modern world was the Industrial Revolution.
mhm,
So, in the Industrial Revolution, we found a bunch of stored sunlight in the ground in the form of black peat turned to black rock coal, and zooplankton and algae turned to oil and natural gas. This was photosynthesis turning to chemical form, compressed by millions of years into dense transportable batteries, and it supercharged everything that we could possibly do. Human ingenuity went through the roof. And if you look at any graph of human progress, right, like child survival rates, size of polities, technological advancement, population size, any metric you want, right? Um, all of those things that you learned about in school is that were kind of important, like the fall of the Roman Empire, the Black Death in Europe, the scientific revolution, the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, blips. These are blips.
Yeah.
They're not even noticeable. There was a one-to-one return on your time with a few mechanical innovations and, fire. It was in the moment when we turned those and we were able to supercharge those with the stored sunlight that everything really takes off. And if you look at the graph, it just hockey sticks up off into the sky on the back of cheap and available batteries, excess energy like we'd never seen before. Okay. So, and this is the story. So in the story, in the book, I talk about like the way that human intelligence works. I talk about the way that we innovate. We defer. We eventually got to the point where we couldn't store all of the information in our own heads, and we deferred the computation for figuring things out to the collective. Here's a term that I wish I'd put in the book because I only thought of it later. It's crowd computing.
Mm.
It's like we ended up figuring things out by everybody focusing on a narrow part of the system, overly specializing, working things out, and sharing across, and that's how new innovations are born. And that's why we see simultaneous invention at the same time. Now, Eurasia has a larger collective brain than do North and South America and Africa, probably due to the sharing of information across the Silk Road, thanks to latitude. Right? It's easy to go east to west. Climate stays the same than it is to cross north to south. Kind of Jared Diamond.
Mhm.
Then one tiny corner of Eurasia, a backwater, in fact. I have this quote from Cicero writing to his, the Roman Senator Cicero writing to his friend Atticus, and he says, "I don't even bother with Britain, right? There's nothing there. You're not gonna find like maybe you'll get some slaves, but they don't know how to write. They don't make music. Like just don't bother, right? That tiny backwater, this outpost of the Roman Empire, eventually finds cheap and available coal under the ground. It's easy, it's close to the surface. And they create with that, they were late to the empire game, but they create with that the largest empire the world has ever seen to the point where you and I are now conversing in English,
Mhm.
right? And they used that to do terrible things. They used it to outcompete and colonize, the world. They outcompeted civilizations that in previous points in history had greater technological sophistication before the discovery of the industrial, before the
Yeah.
industrial revolution. Like you look at the Yellow River Valley in China or the Indus Valley, whatever, greater technological sophistication than certainly Britain, but even Europe, right? Um, and I have this section in the book called "Primitive Peoples and Barbarians and Civilized," and I explain this isn't really about the people; it's about the social networks and the information flow.
Mhm.
Um, anyway, so this one kind of quarter it ends up taking over the world, and then you get this great divergence where Europe kind of takes off, and eventually there is a great convergence where the rest of the world, like Asia, for example, start to catch up thanks to things like the shipping container, as I explained in the book. Okay, that's where we are, that's where we have been. Things changed in the 20th century, particularly after the 1970s, and this is partly why I really wanted to get this book out there. So if you look at those, if you buy the story that excess energy, like what you want is a very small energy sector, and then you want all the other stuff that the energy sector is paying for, the vacations, the time with friends, the amazing food, the ability to travel, all of that stuff that's cheap thanks to cheap energy. You want that to be large, you want the energy sector to be small. If you look at the EROI metrics, the energy return on investment metrics, they all look like this. They are collapsing precipitously. So in 1919, I'll give you one example of oil discovery. They all look like this, as I said. In 1919, one barrel of oil found you another 1,000 barrels.
Mhm.
By 1950, one barrel of oil found you another 100 barrels. By 2010, one barrel of oil found you another five.
Mm.
That means that the excess energy that our civilization, our species has is collapsing on us. The ceiling, if you like,
Mhm.
that energy ceiling is falling. And so the space of the possible. So I didn't even say the other laws. The other two laws are the law of cooperation and the law of evolution. The law of
Mhm.
cooperation is the scale at which is optimal, like, maximally optimal to cooperate is the scale at which I my return as an individual or as a cell or whatever, you want alignment between all these things, is higher than it would be in a larger organism or organization and larger than it would be in a smaller organization or
Mm.
organism, right? So to put it another way, depending on the size of the market, right? If I could start a business and do it all myself and keep 100% of the equity, I'm going to do that.
Mhm.
But I can start a better business by working with other people. And the number of people that it's worth bringing on board, the number of funders, and so on, it depends on the size of the market. It depends on the technology. It depends on the multiply. It depends on all those factors. So what cooperation is doing is in that space of the possible. But what happens is when the ceiling shrinks or innovation slows down, which is what's happened, our capacity for cooperation begins to shrink too.
Mm.
So, what happened? Economic growth. So the correlation between energy access and economic growth is about zero point 0.7, which means that about 50%. If you square that term, 50% of our economic growth is driven by energy access, and the
Mm.
other 50% is probably innovation. We focus a lot on innovation, but we're going through what's called the Great Stagnation. Innovation has slowed down, and our energy
Mhm.
technologies haven't really kept up, which means cooperation is collapsing. So there's so much I can say about this. This is why this is why it's called a theory of everyone. So there's a couple of things. One
Sure.
is, imagine that the economic growth rate is like buses coming along, right? And they're coming, I don't know, every 5 minutes. Like people are standing in a queue, and people are annoyed, right? They're annoyed that some people have these special bus passes that always get them to the front of the line. They're the 1%, right? They're annoyed that, some groups, are lobbying for, so that they get all of their people in the front. Maybe they're ethnic groups, maybe they're occupational groups, maybe they're regions of the country. They're supporting their in group. They're annoyed, but you know what? They're gonna mumble and they're gonna grumble because a bus is coming in 5 minutes and they're gonna get a seat. But if the rate of buses slows down, it's one every hour, it's one every day. Those same fractures that always existed in a society crack and come apart, and you get something more. And that explains, I would say, that energy and the falling energy is what explains the rise of the right wing. It explains the increased polarization that we're seeing today. It explains why society seems like it's coming apart the world over.
Mm. Let me
And
let me
so,
let me jump in here
yeah,
real
go
quick.
ahead.
I'm
Yeah.
curious about something.
Mhm.
I was wanting to hear where you make the link between energy and cooperation, so we can kind of stay on that. So you detailed you kind of traversed the kind of landscape of many things in the book. So you talked about the four laws of energy, or excuse me, four laws of life, which are energy, innovation, cooperation, and evolution. You talked about EROIs, and so I want to stay on cooperation, and then we can link it. And then I do want to ask you about intelligence because I have a bone to pick with you on intelligence. So
Yeah, let's do it.
um, uh, um, okay, so you must have read Nicola Raihani's Social Instinct, the book that she
I
wrote
did. I wrote her an endorsement. Yeah.
2 2 years ago, I think now. Fabulous.
Yeah.
I'm very I'm friendly with her, and I'm sympathetic to how she gives the argument. You mentioned a lot of things there. Ken selection, the grandmother hypothesis is in there. You have reciprocal altruism, interdependence, which I don't think you mentioned, which is also super
Yeah.
important. The back half of the book, for folks, it kind of just starts at the smallest level, how we cooperate within our bodies, with family and kin, and then with other people, and then what that looks like for us as humans. And then that part comes out of her research, I think, with punishment. So I'm interested to hear because I think you're kind of touching on it on how you're linking with energy here. Is this idea of when cooperation goes bad? Because we always so I agree with you. For
Yeah.
many years, people thought that we just kill each other and we're just terrible to each other and look at all the wars, and that's certainly true. Um, but what is also true is one of the ways in which we've been able, I think, to Homo sapiens specifically to survive and thrive is because of cooperation. But cooperation has this kind of dark side to it as well, where basically you can cooperate to like harm people worse or to manipulate people or to scam them over, things like that. Do you think we can bring a few things in here? The threat of punishment itself, these darker sides of cooperation in conjunction with more and more energy needed with less returns coming, do you think those two things are kind of colliding where we're seeing this interplay of maybe some more of the darker sides of cooperation coming out, or where it could go wrong, or how we're
Yeah.
so energy dependent where it's kind of breaking down? Could you talk about cooperation and energy in kind of that way?
Yeah, of course, of course. So, I mean, I've had this discussion with Nicola a few times. So she's at UCL. She's in New Zealand at the moment.
Mhm.
So she's very close by. And of course, I read her book. These mechanisms don't explain cooperation. They don't explain the rise in cooperation, which is an entirely different puzzle.
Mm.
Like they explain why you don't defect versus cooperate. They don't explain why you cooperate with family versus friends versus anonymous strangers.
Mm.
the link between energy and cooperation is that what energy is doing is it's creating something to cooperate toward.
Hmm.
Like, we only cooperate because the rewards, as I said, per person, per whatever, are higher
Hmm.
than not cooperating. And
Right.
that's the scale that it
That's
makes
fair.
sense to cooperate at.
Hmm.
And so, all of these, so you don't need as much punishment when it is in our mutual benefit to work together.
Hmm.
So, yeah, like I say in the book, like, we have cooperated toward our greatest achievements and our worst atrocities. But the puzzle is, who do we cooperate with and at what scale?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so what you need a mechanism to explain, and it can't be punishment because that's always there. It can't be interdependence because that's always there
Hmm.
too. You
Hmm.
have to explain why you're getting this particular scale of cooperation. Like, why is it that you can work at the level of a nation state or
Hmm.
unions of nation states with a common history, rather than kingdoms, princedoms, or local tribes or just family? Like, why are we at that scale and not this scale?
So
And that's what
scale.
energy
So
gives.
so scale is the. Is it the moderating variable? No, it's the mediating variable.
It's
I
what takes
always
the
forget.
outcome variable.
Yeah.
It's what we're trying to explain. The
Yeah.
scale is
Yeah.
what we're trying to explain.
Hmm.
And so that's what energy is, because when we can work together. So if let's say you're Britain, now
Hmm.
you've got factories. Okay, well, you need factory workers. You're
Hmm.
gonna need coal miners. Suddenly, I need to educate a bunch of people to work the factories. I need to work with these people. I'm gonna have to work with them so that they can go get the coal. I need people to work, if it's oil, I need the pipelines. I need it protected. I need, to make the workers happy. Suddenly I need to cooperate at a much higher scale to use this, because I can use this
Hmm.
to outcompete. Because our story is, what humans are competitive,
Hmm.
and we're cooperative, and we cooperate to compete with one another.
Hmm.
And what matters is the scale at which that happens. So actually, one of the points that I make in the book is, the decline in violence, the fact that we live today in one of the most peaceful
Hmm.
times in
This
history.
is
That
Pinker's
is
Pinker's thing, right? He wrote. We start
yeah,
better
yeah.
angels and
Pinker
then enlightenment
popularized
now.
it.
Right. Right.
Exactly.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So there's different explanations for this.
Hmm.
Um, people say, if you're Yuval Harari, you might say it's imagination. But you know what? You can imagine a lot of things. Some worlds better than others, right?
Hmm.
If you're Pinker, he has a bunch of explanations. Some of them, like state capacity. It's like, okay, but how did the state grow, right?
Hmm.
Or why
Hmm.
are we trading with one another rather than working together? Because we do both of those things, right?
Hmm.
And if you want to say it's Enlightenment values, then you need to explain how we are. So, like, it's not ideas, because if you want to say that it's ideas are like they're like genes. They're the fodder for evolution to pick from, right?
Hmm.
Because I've got, like in the book, I've got some stuff from Kant. Then Kant gave us these laudable ideas, like freedom is the alone unoriginated birthright of man and belongs to him by the force of his humanity. Amazing stuff. We still believe that today. Many of us do, right? But he also gave us humanity is at its greatest perfection in the race of the whites.
Hmm.
They're both like Enlightenment values. We reject one, we accept the other. And that needs an explanation. Like, it can't be just the values. Because if it was obvious which of those was the good one and which of those was the bad one, then it would have been obvious before, or it would have been obvious at the time. So
Hmm.
they're not, you know what I mean? They're not like, you need some
Yeah.
mechanism for why the circle is expanding.
Hmm.
And so, the argument that I make in the book is that it's energy. That's what's doing it. And as energy collapses, so here's the thing: violence has declined because energy, thanks to the Industrial Revolution, has allowed us to work in larger groups. And when we work in larger groups, then within those groups, we're not killing each other. But that creates an entirely different dynamic and a completely different prediction about the kind of world we live in today.
So
So we have a
so
model of this.
so
Sorry.
wait, no,
Yep.
real quick. Let me clarify one thing here. Energy is maybe most salient or most proximate for us, but you're not saying it's the only variable, right? You're saying it's maybe the master variable or the most important one, but it's not the only one. How much weight are
It's
you
a cons-
placing on energy?
Yeah. So, I mean, it's a constraining variable, right? So, as I point
Okay.
out, hey, look, there's something called the resource curse. The Democratic Republic of Congo actually has a lot of energy, but
Hmm.
and hunter gatherers walked on fossil fuels for a long time, right? So it's
Hmm.
not
Hmm.
in the book. I make fun of. I don't make fun of it. One of my favorite literary genres, as I say, is the one thing that explains everything. TOTI.
Right.
Gotta have a good acronym.
Uh-huh.
I love these books. I love Guns, Germs, and Steel. Sapiens is good. I love these. They're great, right? But the world is complicated. It is not. There's never one thing that explains everything. Causal arrows fly in multiple directions. They feed back on each other. What you need is a system to explain how the pieces connect together. right? Like if somebody were to say, well, how does a standard model in physics work, or what would explain general relativity? These are not single explanatory things. There's multiple things going on, and that's
Hmm.
why I explained that there's kind of four laws. So in this case, the law of cooperation matters too, right? So it may
Mm.
incentivize higher scales of cooperation, but as we develop new technologies, you can actually do the same with fewer people, which then incentivizes corruption or lower scales of cooperation. Like Putin, as I say in the book, doesn't carry oil fields in his pockets. He is able to control Russian resources with support by oligarchs who then have their supporters and their support. It's billionaires supporting millionaires, supporting everyday people in a network of, political patronage that is out competing the ability of the population to engage in sufficient collective action to depose them, right? Oil companies like Shell and BP are able to go to places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, and they're able to extract resources because they are a cooperative group, shareholders connected to countries and backed by their militaries, at the expense and working not with the whole population, but working with a small group of elites who are happy to take just a small share of that in order to make themselves wealthier at the expense of a population that can't compete.
Mm.
But ultimately, for humanity, for our species, what matters is energy as a kind of ceiling. But for the longest time, it didn't matter because the ceiling was so high for so long that all that mattered was using it more efficiently, the
Mm.
law of innovation.
Mm.
And that was what, economics was invented after,
Yeah.
the Industrial Revolution, um, as it is now at least. All of experimental psychology, with long after,
Mhm.
even things like formal education were in place. Um, Engineers and economists, where you're focused on how to do things more efficiently. It's the law of innovation.
Mm.
But the thing is, at the end of the day, there is a limit to efficiency.
Mhm.
Like, as we all know, it's better to have a great higher income than it is to save more money.
Mhm.
At the end of the day, it's better to have more profits than it is to have more savings. It is, at the end of the day, it requires a certain number of joules to heat a building, even if that building is maximally efficient.
Mhm.
So now, it's only now, because the energy ceiling is falling, that we need to look up,
Yeah.
and go, "Oh, actually, that matters a lot." Can I just say one more thing,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Xavier? Yeah, it's that, so the difference, so for Pinker, things like World War I and World War II are kind of blips, if you like,
Mhm.
right? They're
Mhm.
like, "Okay, this happened, but, it doesn't affect the overall trend." But for our model, you get a different prediction. Those are part of the same process because you're always under threat by lower scales of cooperation like disease and and so on, but also when the scale of cooperation goes up, so too does the potential scale of conflict.
Mm.
So in other words, the world is more peaceful today, but it's actually more dangerous.
Mm.
Because if
Mm.
there is another conflagration, it'll be disastrous, right? And
Mm.
because when it was a world where it was in our mutual benefit to work together because energy was such surplus, then we did work together. But as that falls on us, you're incentivizing lower and lower scales of cooperation. Within countries, you're getting lower scales appearing, and countries are beginning to become more insular. And that means the risk of conflict is greater. So, that we cooperate toward our greatest achievements and greatest atrocities, the
Mhm.
atrocity
Mhm.
stuff is on the horizon. That's what I want to prevent. That's what I want to try to get people to think about.
Yeah, it's a good framing. I like the framing. I think it makes a lot of sense. So I want to talk about where we're going because that's kind of the second part of the book.
Yeah.
So maybe we'll just have a long, I guess, footnote here, and I'll maybe uh, put some context to this. So you do mention about IQ. So obviously there's a kind of rabbit trail we can go down this. So I'll try and keep it kind of just as a footnote,
Here
not
for the
not
hard
derail us.
questions, Xavier.
I know. You you seem to. So okay, and on my side, intelligence is one of the most, in my view, and I think what a lot of the literature shows is intelligence is one of the things that sets humans apart at such a level. That's not to say other animals are intelligent. They are. There's plenty of animals we know that have good intelligence. Different, obviously, with language that makes sets us apart as well, which is kind of connected and loaded with intelligence. I couldn't quite get it in the book clearly. That is probably on my comprehension than your writing, so I'll put it on me.
That's
So,
very kind of you.
um, so I mean, it's not unexpected, right? Right, but you seem to emphasize a lot of the cultural components of IQ, and that you seem to heavily weigh social, cultural things on intelligence as opposed to things like G or some of the genetic or biological underpinnings of IQ. So I guess just just say briefly, I guess, how important do you see intelligence is for humans, and kind of how do you
Mm,
understand the makeup or the shape of intelligence, whether it's cultural and or biological? What's your kind of space there?
yeah. Okay. So intelligence is important for humans, but it's not what you think it is, and the data is tricking you. So let
Okay,
me let me
convince
let
me,
me
convince me.
explain. So, um, where shall I start? All right, let's start here. Imagine. Let me, just wondering where I should enter this moment. So, um,
Or we can
okay,
start with
let's start with
G.
brain.
We can start with
So,
G if you want.
okay, well, let's start with G. Let's start with G. Okay, so the fact that things like correlate with one another. So in the book, I explain F. Like I'm like, okay, this is what
Mhm,
G is. I mean, I don't need to go into this, but if you wanted to find like overall fitness, you get people to do like beep shuttle run, how 1 rep max. How many
mhm,
push-ups can you do, whatever. And you would find probably that there was this overall F, and different things loaded differently on F, and F would predict some sports better than it would others. That's what G is. It doesn't tell you whether it's genetic. It just tells you that these features of solving the world correlate with one another,
mhm,
and they reflect the world as it is today,
mhm,
right? It doesn't tell you anything about whether things are genetic. Um, we know for a fact that a whole bunch of our ability to think is in fact cultural software and not any kind of human human instinct. So take counting. Counting is one of my favorite examples, right?
mhm,
Like many societies count one, two, three, many. And our ancestors counted that way too. We needed a software upgrade in order to count the way we do. So we used to use stones and body parts to count, right? And eventually you put stones and you use them, you press them into clay, and now you've got notches, right? You needed objects to do this. And objects make quite obvious the natural numbers: one, two, three, four, five. All the discrete integer natural numbers are clear.
mhm,
But even then, right, because we didn't have the right metaphor, something like zero wasn't obvious. And it took centuries before zero became a number that we recognized, because zero stones is nothing and nothing is nothing, right?
mhm.
And even once we got to zero, negative numbers, I have this quote from Francis Mazaries. If you would, if you'd let me read it, I find it hilarious.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, yeah.
Let me see. Yeah. So he says, where is it? Yeah. So, he says, negative numbers darken the very whole doctrines of the equations and make dark of the things which are in their nature excessively obvious and simple. Right. Because he doesn't have the right metaphor. So, it's in the 17th and 18th centuries that we start using number lines. So we move away from objects to
Mhm,
movement and position. And now numbers are obvious. You can teach it to even children, to the point where they just internalize it and it's just like they can count. It's very easy. Right. Um, this is something that is delivered to us in our cultural software. And let me show you why the data is misleading. So imagine like a psychologist from Venus came down to Earth and gave everyone the Stroop test.
mhm,
Yeah. And so, I'm sure your listeners know the Stroop test. You've got colors written in different font colors, so red written in blue or red written in red. And when it matches, it's easy. If your job is to say the color and not read the word,
mhm,
people can't help themselves. They read the word.
mhm,
Now, if you didn't know the history of literacy and you didn't know that it was a taught skill, you were a psychologist from Venus just looking at the data, you'd be like, well, color perception is not an important skill for humans, but reading is definitely innate.
mhm,
It's something that humans are just born with. You'd be wrong, of course, but you only know that because you know that history.
mhm,
So, in the same way that there's like a weird people problem, history tells you something else. So, we have these experiments conducted by Alexander Luria in 1920 in an education revolution that was happening in Uzbekistan. And he asks a variety of questions that really get at people's thinking, right? One of the questions he asks is around if P then Q reasoning. So he says, where it snows, the bears are white. In Novaya Zemlya, it snows. What color are the bears? Immediately, your brain's like white. If I asked my 6-year-old, she'd be like white. And when he asked the Uzbeks who'd been to school, they'd be like white. But when he asked the Uzbeks who hadn't been to school, they're like brown. They're like, I don't know. I'm not sure. I haven't been to Novaya Zemlya. Now, obviously, humans are capable of they're capable of counting. They're capable of reasoning in this way. They're capable of these things. But these are trained and taught skills. These are part of and yet they would appear, like they would be part of the Um, they are now part of they're such a part of our society today that they're in our books, they're in our TV shows, they're everywhere. Parents, like, it's just the baseline of knowledge. That is what the Flynn effect really is, right? You can see it in TV shows, by the way, right? Like, our parents and grandparents watch TV shows that we're like, what? Even like the lowest brow TV today has more characters, more convoluted storylines. Uh, Adam West Batman versus The Dark Knight. I Love Lucy versus Rick and Morty. Like,
Mhm.
vast difference. Everything has gotten more complicated,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So the I'm not. This is not like I'm not like saying that there are not genetic differences between people. There are, absolutely. And I'm not saying, your prenatal environment or pollution or nutrition or all that stuff doesn't matter for your brain's hardware. It does. But
Mhm.
what I'm saying is that human intelligence is in the software, the cultural software. And if you want to understand, in the same way, if you want to understand like pivot tables in Excel, or you want to understand ChatGPT, you need a powerful CPU and you need a powerful GPU, but it's not the magic is not in the CPU or the GPU. It's in the software. And you have to understand how that software is written,
Mm.
because that software is changing over time. What was valuable once won't be valuable in the future necessarily. Like, it used to be that you got to memorize a bunch of stuff. Like, my middle school teacher was like, "Hey, you better get good at mental math because you're not going to always carry a calculator in your pocket." Well, buddy, welcome to the iPhone.
Mhm. Mhm.
He didn't foresee that, right? Um, so that's really what the claim is. So what I'm saying is that there is no such thing as culture free intelligence, because what makes us so different to other animals is our reliance on software. So if you think, so one of the things a point that I make in the book is sometimes what it takes for science to move forward is to let go of assumptions that seem just so bleedingly obvious. Like, of course, right? Like, for example, like, it's pretty clear if you stand that the Earth looks flat and there's a sun tracing the sky from east to west, clear as day. Like, why? How could that not be true? But when you let go of that assumption, you make the sun the center and the Earth moving around, in an elliptical orbit, you get a better model of the solar system.
Mhm.
It's the same with humans. When you let go of this assumption that actually we're just this brilliant animal and it's at this hardware level, and it's our big brains, and you build models, this is some of my work, like the cultural brain hypothesis, you actually get a better model that explains far more. And I'll say one more thing in that. You're right. If you think that it is big brains that, like, big brains are awesome, everyone should have. Why don't more animals have big brains? Like, why is it that humans have these giant brains and other animals are not? And I'll tell you why. Brains are like 20 times as calorie consuming as muscle tissue, right? And so if you have a big brain, you have to be able to pay for that big brain.
Mhm.
You have to pay its energy costs. In other words, an animal wants the smallest brain it can get away with to outcompete predators, hunt down food, and outcompete others for mating opportunities.
So I would agree with what you're saying. I mean, I'm very much aligned with the idea that obviously cultural environmental underpinnings are super important. They're super there. I don't quite. I mean, sure, yes, the idea that we have as humans of what are shapes and counting objects, if you go all the way back to the Neolithic period, okay, fair enough. I mean, sure. I mean, obviously that's fair. But I think you don't need to have you could be in any culture currently, and if someone says, "Here's a bunch of shapes, make these blocks, put these blocks together to make the shape," you don't need to have any cultural loading on that. Like, you could be from Sri Lanka or you could be from the United States. You're gonna put blocks together to make a shape. It's the same thing of like, can you remember back, 6 digits? I'm gonna read you the numbers and repeat back for me. You don't need cultural loading as much. There certainly are, especially for things like verbal comprehension or comprehension on various measures. Absolutely. Absolutely. If you ask somebody what's a trellis, they're not going to know what the fuck that is, right? Like, I fully grant you, like, there's issues with certain measurements or issues with certain tests, and there have been much advancements to try and make them more neutral or things like that. And obviously, people, I think, overemphasize Raven's progressive matrices, which is supposed to be culture free. Um, you know, but there's some statistical issues with the measurement or whatever. But I just think in terms of understanding intelligence, obviously, if you think of intelligence as a multi-component process, right, of solving novel, of using novel solutions in novel problems or solutions in novel problems, I think that that's going to be there currently with humans. for many aspects, right? Nonverbal reasoning, perceptual reasoning, or visual spatial, or processing speed. You're just looking at certain things. I certainly think some aspects of intelligence are going to be more heavily weighted socially, culturally, environmentally. Absolutely. But I don't think the whole entire concept of all the components of intelligence, there are some that are just going to be, listen, your biology and your genetics is just, it's not so great for you, and that's fine. But you make up your relative strengths and weaknesses, maybe are a little bit better than some of the normative ones. That's fine. But I think that that's also true as well. And I don't think you're not saying that, but maybe you just lean a little heavier on the cultural loadings. But I'm not
I,
sure.
I mean, what you said about like there are differences between people. Like, yeah, I'm not saying that, right? What I'm saying is that like the what your assumptions about there are these things that humans have, they're just anyone in the world, no matter where you're from, you're going to be able to do this, is because you're getting your data from a thoroughly schooled world in which a cultural download has taken place that has given you a bunch of software upgrades that is now your baseline. So we have an experiment. Well, I'll tell you some data, right? So we have
Okay.
an experiment where we're trying to get at this in Southern Africa.
Okay.
There's a natural experiment going on. One side of the river, these people. So it's very difficult to get at what school does because schools everywhere.
Hmm.
Literacy rates are crazy high. It's wonderful. Like what is it? Like 200 years ago, 12% of the world could read and write. Today, 12% can't read and write.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, and when most of the time when they can't, when they have not been exposed to any schooling at all, it's because of like war or poverty or like some other insult that is causing like you can't distinguish that from any other effects.
Yeah.
We searched the world for 2 years to try to find a natural experiment. We found one in Southern Africa. It's a border experiment. Same people cross and marry, so there's gene flow, culture flow, just an institutional difference. We gave them things like the Ravens color progressive matrices.
Mm.
The people who are exposed to school, if they're exposed to, let me say it like this: 8-year-olds and 18-year-olds perform identically on it if they're not exposed to school. When they have moderate exposure to school, it's a moderate effect. When they have great exposure to school, it looks more like the West, right?
Hmm.
These tests are measuring what our schools are giving you, and your data can't distinguish it because you're talking about a thoroughly schooled world. And of course, look, the more the cultural heritability. I don't know if you've read my paper, The Cultural Evolution of Genetic Heritability, but it's
Maybe.
a BBS paper. Lots of fun discussion. Have a look. This is where I make the case in
Hmm.
full throated detail, but we have a nice model as well that you can play with and adjust, and you'll see. But heritability is a great indication of equality, really, of opportunity, right? The more heritable something is, the more opportunity is. Because of course, you and I both know that if the world was like perfectly equal, same home environment, same access to resources, your mom was eating all the right things when she was pregnant, no smoking, all the blah 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 blah. Heritability would be like 100% minus random noise and developmental
Hmm.
variation,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
So that's the thing. Like you can't get at this with the current data. You need these kinds of things. And if you want to make a claim about like, well, if you want to cling to this idea that there's something about intelligence that's not cultural, it's in the kind of lower level processing or something like that. Well, start looking at chimps and take a look at where how much better we are there, and show me how you build up from that to what you think is going on. Because like in our models, why we have a big brain is because of this cultural evolutionary process that leads to an accumulation of knowledge that can't fit in the brain, which means you want a larger brain to store and manage that information.
Hmm.
And something like language is not an explanation. Language is part of the puzzle. Like if I were the only one, if I, you gotta start a problem with language, right? Like if I'm the one with the language mutation and I'm like, Xavier, rah, 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 and they're like, why is he making these funny sounds? You don't know my language. You have language only works as a cooperative issue. Like other people have to have it. So you have to have a ratcheting process. And in our models, we have that. The ratcheting process is that as the body of knowledge begins to grow, there's something worth transmitting. Early on, probably fire, and then maybe some early bone and wooden tools, and then maybe later, stone tools. So as that body of stuff worth transmitting grows, then the channels for transmission are selected,
Hmm.
right? So it's like guttural utterances are matched by. In my story, what I think happened is that because we were bipedal, it freed up our hands. And freeing up our hands did at least two things. One, it cheapened the cost of tools,
Hmm.
because if you're making these tools and you're quadrupedal, you're carrying this big ass rock around everywhere, and you don't want to do that,
Right.
right?
Right.
But if you're bipedal, you make it, and you can afford to spend time sharpening that stone axe because you can take it somewhere else and use it again, right?
Hmm.
The other thing it did is it created another channel for communication. Like, even if, I did another podcast where it's just pure audio, and I'm still waving my hands, it's not just Italians, it's everybody. Like, deaf kids are like babbling with their hands. So it opens this pathway for supplementing. And then when you get mutations, you get what's called a Baldwinian process, where when something can be learned and it's valuable, genes that can help you learn it faster are selected. So we literally had changes to our throat that made us more susceptible to choking. I love this line. I'm going to say it. I was very proud of it. We were dying to speak to one another.
That's a good line. That's a good line.
So it's like all of these changes. And so now you have a ratcheting process, but it only makes sense in light of this growing cultural corpus that needs to be transmitted.
Mm.
And that same selection pressure, by the way, is present today. So we maxed out on brain size, right? It became too difficult to birth it. We ate from the tree of knowledge and had the curse of Eve. Get it? Okay, so we had trouble birthing these big brains. If you look at the medical literature today, by the way, the predictor for emergency cesareans and emergency forceps, right, is not the size of the baby; it's the size of their head.
Yeah.
Once it hits the 85th percentile, it hockey sticks upward, right? So you begin to, and so then you do other things. You begin to transmit better. So initially, it was probably just gaze following. Eventually, social tolerance, language, all of these things. We see it today, right? As the cultural corpus has grown, we're trying to pack more and more into our education systems. We're trying to learn. We spend longer and longer. We have a longer juvenile period and a cultural adolescence just to keep up. So the cultural adolescence is when you can reproduce to when you actually do. Xavier, I don't want to take you back, but remember when you could reproduce? Took you a little while before then, presumably, right? It wasn't 13 or 14 that you had your first kid, if you have any, Like, we've been delaying that to the point where now it's like the ability to give birth at an older age that is the selection pressure. And it's the same thing. As the cultural corpus grows, the transmission has to get better, right? Or you spend longer learning. It's like, that's why. So one of the hallmarks of a periodic table of people, if you like, or an overarching theory, is that it connects the seemingly disconnected into a cohesive theory that doesn't require separate mini explanations for each thing. The whole thing suddenly comes into light. And the way I wrote the book, I should say, is like, in a world of like fraud everywhere and a literature that God knows no one should trust, you can't. Don't believe me because five studies said so. They are there. They're in the further readings. I explain it to you. Like, I want you to understand how this whole thing hangs together, and then you can go look at the evidence. But it hangs together. And one of the claims I make in this book is that once you see it, you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
Like, once the tapestry is made obvious, like, suddenly maybe it'll take a while, but it'll churn, and then suddenly it'll be like, oh.
Yeah. Well, I'm still not quite convinced on the cultural aspect of so much weight, but you make good arguments, and I will read the paper, and
it would cause you to revamp your whole worldview. So I understand why you're ready.
No.
But you know what? You're students.
I think no. I would certainly change my view on it. I just think there is strong. I know people get really squeamish about heritability and genetics.
I'm not one of those people, by the way.
I don't think you are.
I'm not one
but
of those
I know
people.
a lot of people are, and so I'm not. I don't really care. I mean, so
Dude,
if that is good, it's good.
Let me just say something. Like, I explained in the book what it means. Like, I explained like genetic differences and what it means for population. I go everywhere. Like, I'm not like, honestly, it's an honest appraisal of how I see the world. That's not the reason. And I would love to see some strong arguments, but I just don't think that. So the cultural evolution of genetic heritability, one of the points I make is like, I'm engaging with your literature. I've incorporated it. It makes perfect sense in my world. You don't even understand this world. You don't understand how broken your worldview is. So until that happens, it's a one-sided thing.
I have all my hereditary friends. So I'll give them the email that you have that you got.
I look forward to all the angry emails. I got a few when I wrote that paper, and I engaged with them.
Just kidding. Okay, so for a little bit here, we can talk about the second part of the book. Obviously, many things in the second part of the book. So there's a few things I want to ask about. Okay, all of these could be 2 hours at least on themselves. So we'll try and get to some of them. I want to ask you about diversity and immigration, wealth and income inequality, and we can talk a little bit about kind of social media or things like that. So let's do immigration globally. I'm really, really interested in this because there's obviously, I mean, you've been here in the US, and there's the very US centric way of talking about immigration, which is frustrating because I just don't think anybody's being honest about it. But I do understand a little bit that immigration globally in Western Europe, in Eastern Europe, in parts of Asia, in Africa, it just looks a little bit different, but there is a lot that's there. So where is your kind of model here factoring into how we think about
Yeah.
migration, immigration, things like that?
Okay. So, the first thing to say is that, if you buy this view that culture, like this cultural software that people are running, incidentally, we even have data, like we have some new data that like visual illusion susceptibility differs by culture. So really low level stuff, right?
Mhm.
Um, that so let me say this: when most animals encounter a new environment, they're forced to genetically adapt,
Mm.
right? Like faster muscles to outrun predators, and skin color changes for humans to match UV radiation, so you don't get cancer from too little vitamin D or skin cancer. That's what most animals end up having to do. And they do some individual learning as well. Like humans kind of culturally evolved and adapted to specific situations. So where they learned how to hunt the local predators. They didn't develop like proteins in their body to process the poisonous plants. They learned how to process the plant like cassava, before they cooked it and ate it, right? So they
Mm.
developed all these technologies. So people around the world do differ from one another. And we are a migratory species. Migration is the human story. And when we meet each other, sometimes we cooperate, sometimes we exchange ideas, and sometimes we fight with each other. Right? It depends on resources and there's all kinds of factors that happen. But we face an interesting situation today where people from very different parts of the world with very different ways of viewing the world are living side by side. That is mitigated somewhat by education.
Mm.
So we have a paper under review at the moment where we show that education makes you kind of more American. Actually, it shrinks the cultural distance
Mm.
relative to lower education, right? Because it is this cultural download, right? The way I describe this challenge is as a paradox of diversity. You want to grab this bull by both its horns, and that is that diversity is fuel for innovation for reasons I explained in the book. That innovation is primarily driven by recombining ideas, and this gives you new ideas to recombine. Immigrants are the lifeblood; they are America's super serum. But diversity is also divisive by definition,
Yep.
right? Like if we don't speak the same language, like literally, if we don't speak the same language, this would be kind of a boring podcast for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Uh, and there'd be no exchange of ideas. And I think machine learning is going to remove this problem, but whatever for now. Um, there are other things like food preferences. I like sushi, you like schnitzel. Who cares, right?
Mhm.
Like we'll work it out. We'll have to find somewhere for
I
lunch.
mean, I like both.
And then there's all these things in between. Sorry,
I like both. Yeah,
what's that?
both are great.
Yeah,
Sushi's
I like
great.
those too, to be honest. So like but then there's all these things in between, like
Mhm.
hierarchy, hard work, or the ability to work with the opposite sex. All of these subtle things that
Mhm.
affect communication and coordination. And
Mhm.
so, from my perspective, the goal is optimal assimilation, where you're assimilating along the lines that affect coordination and communication, and you're leaving the rest of the stuff alone. Like let people, live their lives however they see fit. Right. All right. So then, how do you achieve that in practice?
Mhm.
How does one design a sane and sensible immigration policy that doesn't create this? There are different models of immigration around the world. And first thing I should say, by the way, is that there's a big difference between immigration to the New World,
Mhm.
nations of immigrants that are building and creating, like America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Like, there's a difference between that kind of immigration and Europe, where you have
Yeah.
pre-existing monocultural situations, and now you've got immigrants entering that.
Yeah.
It's not so straightforward that you can just borrow and learn and take from one place and add to the next. Okay.
Mhm.
So I discussed like three major models of multiculturalism, and these are stylized models. Every country has some elements of these, right? Um, but this is often how countries describe themselves, right?
Mhm.
So one model is what I call the no hyphen model, and it was after I named it after this debate or a disagreement that happened between Trevor Noah of the Daily Show
Mhm.
and Gerard Arad, the French ambassador. So France is associated with the no hyphen model. So Trevor, he makes a joke that Africa won the World Cup after the French won it because I don't know, 12 of the players or something were of African descent. He's like, you don't get that tan in the south of France. And Gerard Arad, the ambassador gets super angry. He's just like, France is a cosmopolitan nation, but roots are an individual identity. We don't have Muslim French and Algerian French. Or what. We just have French, just French. No hyphens,
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, You hear like a little French accent like slipping out there. Sorry. And so, in practice, of course, it's very hard to do that because you want migrants who actually do want to assimilate. You have to have a welcoming population that brings them into the social fold. You want to have people coming not in too large numbers because otherwise they're going to form enclaves. And it's difficult to achieve that, and France does not for the most part,
Mhm.
right? And of course, it's like brutal colonial history where it didn't give people a choice. It tried to suppress their culture. That's
Mhm.
not like the conditions that you can
Yeah,
have a
no.
no hyphen model.
Mhm.
Then you've got like, Canada's mosaic model, sometimes called the salad bowl. They had to do that. Canada had to do that because they had this French colonies, they got the English colonies. What are we going to do? We're just going to speak both languages. Hello, bonjour.
Mhm.
Classic Canadian, entry into Canada. And so what do? They're like, just everybody, just like you work it out. It's going to be a beautiful mosaic. But as I say in the book, like that probably works when there's lots of resources, but mosaics are more fragile than a single pane of glass when put under pressure.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
You know. And then they've got the American model, which is the melting pot. The idea is everybody come to America, we're going to melt all into one. Now, like I said, these are idealized, right? Like in reality, some ingredients are going to be stronger flavors than others. Some may say America's a little too cheesy. Then you've got like Unk Morepork. This is Terry Pratchett. He says Unk Morepork is the melting pot of the world that sometimes runs afoul of pieces that don't quite melt, right? So you do have this multicultural element that can be a challenge. What I argue is that all of these models fail to account for the fact that a lot of what's going on with people's ability to work together is resources. It's that bus analogy I gave you before. It's the energy. And so
Yeah.
when there's plentiful resources, then it's great. But one way to ameliorate so many of these problems is invest in infrastructure. Look, when schools and jobs and hospital places are hard to access, people are pissed off at each other anyway. And now when newcomers come in and you're providing them with a bunch of resources, you don't think people are going to be pissed
Oh
off?
yeah. Oh yeah.
They are. You know? That's not great. So you have to invest in that infrastructure to match the growing population, and that's a function or whatever. Now, if you are, from the perspective of the country, if you're trying to create a situation where you have there's a limited number of immigrants you're going to let in, and you're going to select among them, right? Then you want to select the ones that are going to be most successful for you and for the country, especially if you are a social welfare state, because those who contribute more are going to, well, they help maintain the social welfare state. So in that case, the way to think about immigration is that you are sampling from a distribution because cultures are not homogenous. It's not like all of China is a certain kind of people and all of America. Like your American listeners will know that, yeah, of course you can talk about American culture, but the East Coast looks different to the West Coast,
I
right?
mean,
The
yeah.
West
What
Coast.
is it? America, the United States is like 6 different countries. All you got the South, you have the East
Right,
Coast, New
American
England.
nations,
Right. Right.
Albion seed. Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right. Right. Right.
exactly.
Right.
But even at a lower level, right? Like Boston looks. Where are you, Xavier?
I'm just outside DC, so mid
Okay.
Atlantic.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah. All right. So DC, like tri-state, whatever. Like New York looks different to Boston, and
Yeah.
then even within even within New York, like different parts of the city are different
Yeah,
culturally.
Long
So
Island
what
is
you really
much
look
different than Manhattan, from what I understand.
exactly, 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 and even within Manhattan,
Right.
it's like
Right.
East
Right. Right.
Village,
Right. Right. Right.
whatever. And so what you're really looking at are like beliefs and behaviors and values and goals and ways of thinking that are distributions, and they overlap to different degree, and they are they're nested in one another. And when you get immigrants from a country, you are sampling from that distribution.
Mhm, mhm.
If it is like a refugee crisis, like actually people fleeing, then economic framing is the wrong one. That's a humanitarian crisis, but you still have to solve the paradox of diversity. It's just
Mhm,
you have a harder time with it. But if you can select, you can begin to look at, well, what age, like so Australia and Canada have like points-based systems. 25 to 36 is a sweet spot where it's like you had some education and you have a whole lifetime of like work ahead of you. That's a good time to get people, highly educated, and also um, fitting into jobs and roles that the country needs. So I call it the umbrella model for a couple of reasons. One is that it resources the umbrella matter. So if like people are like if the umbrella isn't large enough to keep everyone out of the rain, then people fight over the umbrella and then everyone's out in the rain.
mhm.
But you can also think of it as like an umbrella corporation. Like what you're trying to like if you want to think about company culture, but you also want to make sure you're hiring people that everybody recognizes we need a role. Like we need these people. Like we
Yeah.
need more hairdressers. We need more fruit pickers. We need more accountants, engineers, whatever.
Mhm.
when everybody recognizes it, they're less resentful. And that's,
Mhm.
the closest country that comes to this is Australia, has lots of problems, doesn't process refugees fast enough, does some horrendous things, but it's the closest that comes to this umbrella model, but no country really does.
Mm.
But I think the way to think about this is to take culture seriously. Think about it as this kind of sampling problem, and think about it as balancing these kind of, fiscal responsibilities against kind of social cohesion. And it's on both sides. It's about a population that welcomes newcomers. So under what conditions are people more likely to be welcomed? And under what conditions are they more likely to be resented?
Mm.
And thinking carefully about that. Because otherwise, when you're naive about these things, you're like Germany during the 2015 migration
Yeah,
crisis, which
yeah.
incidentally was probably one of the first climate change created migration crises in the Western world,
Mhm.
where, like Angela Merkel was like, what is it, "Wir fahren das," it's like, "We can do this." And then later on, I think the second in command was just like, "We underestimated what this was about," right?
Mhm.
Or you're
Mhm.
Sweden, a lot of I talked to like
Mhm.
leaders in a lot of
Yeah, yeah,
countries,
yeah.
and they're like,
Mm.
I Sweden, they're a wonderful people, but we culture does matter. It is a real thing, and that's a
Of
controversial thing to
course.
say, but
Of course.
but this is not so my real fear here is that people go, "Okay, well, that means we want only culturally close people." And that's like a natural it's the way that companies are like, "We just want people kind of like us." Like, we want diversity in the sense, like, we want people with different melanin levels and some women, but they gotta, it's more like me.
Mhm.
And that's an easy solution, and it's a solution, but both the most innovative teams and the least innovative teams are diverse.
Mhm.
It only makes sense when that diversity can work together. So there's an opportunity when you have greater diversity coming in, but insofar as you can maintain those um, that cohesion. So I tell a story, Xavier. This is a true story. So my wife used to work she's a volunteer in refugee resettlement in Australia.
Mm.
So Australia has things like the Australian Cultural Orientation Program. It's like a 5-day program
Mm.
before refugees even arrive, so they understand what kind of resources they're going to get, how to catch public transport, banking, the laws of the land, and how to make
Mm.
friends, what's appropriate, inappropriate. It's like a crash course in how to be an Aussie. Yeah. And once you get there, it's like you got to swear a lot. You got to sorry, it's like once you get there, there's a lot of resources sent your way, right? So they get people with like similar cultural backgrounds, or
Mm.
people who had come before to teach you about how to cook the local foods in your
Mm.
cuisine. How what's appropriate and inappropriate. Like there's a way to kind of like it's like onboarding employees. You're like
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
onboarding newcomers,
yeah. Mhm.
but they recognize non-negotiable. So she remembers a story about there was this guy who came in, and he didn't want to talk. So there was at the time there's only like female volunteers, and he didn't want to talk to her because she's a woman. He came from
Mhm.
a place that was okay. And so he just sat there. She's like, "I'm the only one who can help you, man." Like just and she just sat there for hours, and then
Mhm.
he left. And then
Mhm.
he came back the next day, and he sat there for hours, and he left. And he came back the third day, and he begrudgingly took her assistance. And now many countries would be like, "That was culturally insensitive of you. Like you should have got him a man." Right? But you got it. You got it. Like maybe your culture is like, that's we accommodate that. Okay, but it's not good for social cohesion. Like there's some baseline norms
Mhm.
that every country has to decide for themselves what they want to enforce.
Mhm.
As because remember, laws are hardened cultural norms. They are resting on invisible pillars.
Yeah.
And just as much as it can be difficult to take institutions from one place and transport them to another when the norms are missing, right? Like Liberia has America's institutions, but is not as successful as America.
Mhm.
Papua New Guinea has Australia and Britain's institutions, but is not as successful. In the same way, the norms going in the other direction,
Mhm.
there can be a mismatch, and you have to assimilate people along some basics, like rule of law, for example,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, that's enough to get me in trouble. Let's leave it at
Yeah,
that.
no, no, no. I mean, I don't I think that's a bigger conversation that I think needs to be had. And like you said, there are certain countries that are a little bit more homogenized. When you were talking, I was thinking about Japan. They do it very differently. Obviously, though, in a homogenized country like Sweden or Finland or Denmark, they've had different struggles with this. I do think it looks a little bit different for a country like the United States or maybe even Canada or something. But
But
I
we've been
do
very
think
successful.
theoretically, sort of a version of this onboarding is appropriate, but trying to mm, kind of nationally have that conversation, I mean, at least here in
Yeah.
the US,
Look,
I can
we need
already
yeah,
hear the
we need an
conversations.
adult conversation. No, I
Yeah,
totally we need an
I
adult
can already
conversation.
hear that
You know
pushback.
why?
But I agree with you.
Let me
I agree with you.
no, but let me tell you why. It's because it's good for migrants and locals. Like, we have to be able to work with one another. We have to be able to talk to one another, and this ensures that people come over and they don't have the success that they anticipated, and part of that is, like, that cultural gap. Like, language programs, for example, right? One of the easiest, lowest hanging fruit for helping
Yeah.
people economically integrate at a minimum, and then socially integrate, because it's hard to be friends with people that you can't speak to,
Right.
right?
I mean, I would say this is for me in my view. The reason why immigration is always an issue, not just in the U.S. but around the world, is because I see it as it's a I think of an analogy of like a coin. On one side of the coin, you have immigration, and on the other side of the coin, you have ideas of nationalism or patriotism, whatever you want. And I think if you have a healthy type of nationalism where you say, look, these are our norms, these are our cultures, these are our things that we do, this is what, language we speak, food we eat. Yes, regionally or geographically, there's variance, but generally, this is the Australian way, the Canadian way, the American way, whatever that looks like. Um, that doesn't mean, I can already hear people listening to this. That does not, I'm not saying that the American way is the white way. I think it's a variety of ways. It's white, black, native, Latin, Asian, right? There's a way, but we do have things with all of those races or ethnicities that separate us from England, right? So like there is an American way, and that doesn't just equal white. That said, you have to say, look, if you're going to come from Yemen, there's a different way that the United States does things than in Yemen.
It's
It's not
actually
better. It's not
one of the most.
worse. It's
Yeah,
just different. And here's how we do this.
yeah,
But I think again, people are already getting real tense hearing me say that, or like, oh my gosh, this is not the way. This is xenophobic, and I don't think any of those things. I think you want all sorts of folks, not
what
just the lawyers
yeah,
and doctors. You do want other folks to come and do that where there's value in certain types of work where you can contribute, but you have to have certain kind of baseline. I think a type of onboarding of sorts for every country with
yeah.
that has to deal with lots of migration is
Yeah.
needed.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I don't think it needs to be like so, paternalistic in that there are some
Hmm.
things like we got to speak the same language, man. Like we have to. That's
Right.
like the most minimum baseline. But apart from that, like it is just about like people talking to one another, negotiating these norms, right? Like figuring out like and part of it is like the numbers people come in. Like you don't want enclaves of people. You
Yeah.
prefer people to like it's like, in the kid literature, it's like when if you're a kid, you're at school and you like Pokemon, you find other kids who like Pokemon even if they're a different ethnicity. But if you've got a
Yeah.
large number of co-ethnic people, now you can match on a whole bunch of things apart from Pokemon and you get more segregation.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, you want to try to find ways of getting people to work with one another and talk to one another. And by the way, I should say America does this really well because of this long run history of migration. So, there's a section in my book about why Americans smile so much and have such a focus on emotions.
Hmm.
Because, if your neighbor doesn't speak your language, is from a different place, you have to be explicit about those
Hmm.
norms. You have to be explicit in your communication, and emotion is one way to do it. If I'm happy, you want to know I'm happy.
Hmm.
If you're Japan, you can be more muted. Everybody knows if you're happy because of the context.
Right. Right.
You know?
Right.
So there's a whole bunch of this. I encourage people to read before you get mad at me about anything I just said, read the book, see what I said, and then get mad at me, get mad at me what about I actually said, not what you think I said.
That's totally fair. Yes. Maybe we can give just a small, just kind of brief off ramp here. I did want to hit on like, obviously it's a big topic as well, but wealth, income inequality. So maybe just
Oh yeah,
the
yeah,
key point there again, huge topic, but the key point that I took from that was you have this idea of meritocracy to mediocrity. So talk about this kind of concept of how we're trying to
yeah.
globally or for certain countries figure this kind of way out with inequality.
Yeah. So, have you ever heard the phrase like talent is equally distributed, but opportunity is not?
Yeah.
It's it's not strictly true, man. Like talent is not equally
Oh
distributed,
no, I've heard the
but
saying. No, I don't think
opportunity.
it's true.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but opportunity definitely isn't right. Like so, although
Hmm.
talent is
Hmm.
not equally distributed, opportunity definitely isn't. And I
Hmm.
think we can at least agree that like an ideal world, let's say, is one where you are not limited by the circumstances of your birth. Right?
Hmm.
Like that what we do every generation is we get our best and brightest
Hmm.
and we give them the opportunity to push our species forward, and we give everyone else the opportunity to back whoever they want, to have their voices heard, to have, and so to get that, you need, you need resources, you need access to whatever. And so there are certain policies that entrench things and shrink the opportunities over time. And when that happens, people start reaching out for other ways to equalize that, as I said, lead us from meritocracy to mediocrity.
Mm.
They like, well, we should get rid of standardized testing, even though standardized testing is one of the best ways for a poor kid to demonstrate how clever they
Mm.
are, right? And that's why, it's like, even without test preparation, many kids are able to kind of demonstrate this, and you can account for, wealth in adjusting scores, for example, right? You can think about things like that. You don't have to do it in this gross way. We know there's all kinds of problems with affirmative action. This is a conversation that's currently being
Mhm.
well, literally litigated
Mhm.
in the United
Mhm.
States.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so I basically argue that this comes back to like how we think about even something like redistribution. I explained that the amount of inequality, wealth inequality, is way bigger than people think it is, like
Mhm. Mhm.
unimaginably so.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But it's not necessarily a problem. What matters is how that wealth inequality comes about,
Mm.
and whether it reflects contributions, and whether it reflects what money really is. It's a lien on energy. What money really is it's a share in our goods and services. And the more money you have, the more you can direct the our energy budget to whatever you think is important. And so what you want to be doing is taxing unproductive money. So don't like what in my world, this sounds really radical, but if you read it, you'll understand. The difference between a utopia and a better place is the acceptance of constraints.
Mm.
And I lay out pathways that show us from where we are today how we can relax some constraints and get closer to where we ought to be. So, for example, transitioning to a land value tax for a multitude of reasons, and dropping income and sales and capital gains taxes would result in, because if you're literally like rent seeking, you're engaging in wealth appropriation rather than a wealth creation. What you want people is to move their asset allocations toward things that generate wealth, that increase the space of the possible, that raise that energy ceiling, or lower the energy floor, the innovation efficiency floor, and increase the space of possible so that we have more opportunities for everyone. It's hard for me to kind of compress this big argument into a like a very short space of time.
Mhm.
But I think that's the goal, and what I lay out is how we might get there. And I get into things like startup cities as a way to kind of
Mhm.
get past nation states.
Mhm.
Programmable politics is a potential possibility in the future. The role of AI in
Mhm.
in equalizing some of these things.
Mhm.
There's a, there's too much. I want to talk to you for another two
No, I know,
hours,
I know,
Xavier.
I
This has
know.
been
This is
fantastic.
not. There's not enough time. But I mean, again, I mean, so many other questions I had. But I think that what's good though is that people have a sense, hopefully, that there's a lot of ways in which the book touches it, and I found like I mean, obviously it's a book, right? But so it really does all go together. Go is that you get the first part, and when you get that in you, then it gives this really nice kind of backdrop or kind of context for all the other stuff, all the controversial stuff in the back half of the book. So again,
Do not read the
let
second half first. Read the first half.
don't read the second half first. Yeah, read it in order. The last question I have for you is, after all these topics and all these things, and many we didn't cover, what do you think for just the average listener that's listening in? Obviously, read the book and stuff, but beyond that, what do you think are effective ways in which we can, pragmatically understand and make changes in the world?
I mean, as I say at the end of the book, like change has always happened because an easily understood idea was, a small group of people with that easily understood idea were pushing for that change. And so what I hope is, like, obviously if you read this book, it'll point you to different things, like things you can really advocate for that will leave this world a better place. So, land value taxes. Because here's what I think. I think people can feel in their bones that something is broken in our world, that something is wrong right now.
Mhm.
And people, I mean, as a population, people are kind of scrambling. Like they're like, we should, we need to tax billionaires. We need to close the borders. We need to open the borders. We need to, like, they're like just reaching for things.
Mhm.
And what I'm hoping is that when you see who we are, how we got here, and where we could go, then you realize, okay, that doesn't, you can separate the trying to turn lead into gold stuff, like the nonsense, from like, actually that won't work for this reason, but actually maybe this other thing will. And all of these people who are entrenched in this perspective, they're wrong for this, and you can articulate exactly why they're wrong. And of course, I don't mind being wrong. I personally don't mind being wrong. That's how we learn. I'm happy for people to be like, "Oh, you're totally wrong about this," and for here whatever reason. I send it to a lot of experts. If you read the endorsements, you'll see it's like every discipline under the sun.
Mhm.
And so I feel comfortable about the facts on the ground, but like I would want people to engage with this, to argue over it, to discuss, send me questions, emails. Like
Mhm.
I want to start a conversation. Like
Mhm.
this book was not. It's not me like writing a good book because I'm like, "Oh, I should write a book." This is really me trying to get a message out there
Mm.
that I think will be good for people's own lives because they can begin to apply it to make themselves more creative and more successful and their kids and the world.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, definitely made me it pushed me and made me think about a lot of different things. The book is called A Theory of Everyone: The New Science of Who We Are, How We Got Here, and Where We're Going. This is through MIT Press. It's out in the UK and Australia now, and it's out in the
Yeah.
United States on October
So it's
30th,
it's
31st.
Hachette actually. It's Basic Books Hachette in the UK and Australia,
Uh, ba-
MIT Press in
oh,
the US.
oh, okay, yeah, it's in the US.
Just want to
It's,
acknowledge
yeah, all
all my
this.
publishers. Yeah.
So the book's great. I hope people check it out. Is there anywhere? I know you're doing a bunch of things, but is there any particular place that you? I mean, aside from the book, that you want to point people to? A paper, website, anywhere where you're at? Anything you want to point people to?
Yeah, so you can find, how to buy the book at atheoryofeveryone.com, and you can find me by googling me or michael.muthukrishna.com. I try to keep my website mostly up to date. Oh, follow me on Twitter, smash that
Mhm.
subscribe, ring that bell, whatever. Find me on social media wherever you are.
Mhm. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Thanks very
Michael,
much for
this
having
was
me, Xavier.
so much fun. I really, really, really did appreciate it, and we'll have to do this again another time as well.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.